your secret that you can't tell anyone because it will probably ruin your life. It was a Tuesday evening when I first noticed it. The air had that sticky, late summer heat to it that makes everything feel a little slower, a little heavier. I was sitting on the couch in my mom's living room, nursing a cold beer while my stepdad, Frank, was in his usual chair, staring at the muted TV. Mom was bustling around in the kitchen, clattering dishes and humming some old tune she'd picked up from God knows where. It was a typical evening in their house, the kind I'd experienced 100 times before, but that night something felt off. Frank was always a quiet man, the kind who believed more in actions than words. He wasn't one for long-winded speeches or pointless chatter, but there was a warmth to his silence, a presence that filled the room even when he wasn't saying anything. He'd always been like that, a man of few words but with a heart as big as the sky. We'd talk about football, or the car he was fixing up, or sometimes he'd tell me stories from his time in the army. They were never grand stories, no tales of heroism or combat. Just little things that stuck with him. The kind of stories you can only tell if you've lived a life that's seen both the good and the bad. But lately, Frank had been even quieter than usual, and it wasn't just that he wasn't talking. It was the way he seemed to retreat into himself, like he was trying to fade into the background. That night, as I watched him, something about the way he sat there, eyes fixed on the TV but not really watching it, gnawed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Hey, Frank," I called out, trying to sound casual. "You all right?" He blinked and turned his head slightly, like he hadn't noticed I was there until that moment. "Yeah," he said after a beat. "Just tired, I guess." But I wasn't buying. There was something in his voice. Something that didn't sit right. It was too flat, too empty, like he was saying the words just to get me off his back. "You've been pretty quiet these days," I pressed on, leaning forward in my seat. "Everything okay?" Frank glanced toward the kitchen, where Mom was still busying herself with dinner. She hadn't noticed our conversation, or if she had, she was pretending not to. Frank's eyes flicked back to the TV, then to me. He hesitated for a moment, and I could see the gears turning in his head like he was trying to find the right words. "If I don't say anything," he said slowly, "I can't say anything wrong." I frowned at that, not sure what he meant. "What do you mean, Frank? You can tell me anything. You know that, right?" He gave me a small, tired smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know, kid, but it's better this way." And that was it. He turned his attention back to the TV, effectively ending the conversation. I sat there for a while longer, nursing my beer and mulling over what he'd said. It wasn't like Frank to dodge a question like that, especially not from me. We'd always been able to talk, even if it was just about the little things. But that night, it felt like there was a wall between us, one that I couldn't see but could definitely feel. I let it go that night, figuring maybe he really was just tired, or maybe he and Mom had had one of their spats. They never really fought, but they had their moments, like any couple. I chalked it up to that, and told myself I'd bring it up again another time when things were a little calmer. But as the weeks went by, Frank's silence didn't lift. If anything, it deepened. He started slipping away into these long stretches where he wouldn't say a word, just sit lost in his own thoughts. The light in his eyes that had always been there, even when he was quiet, was starting to dim, and it scared the hell out of me. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself alone with him in the garage. He was tinkering with his old Ford, the one he'd been fixing up for years, but never quite seemed to finish. The smell of motor oil and the sound of tools clanking against metal filled the air, familiar and comforting in a way. I leaned against the workbench, watching him work. "Frank," I started, trying to keep my tone light, "you know you can talk to me about anything, right?" He didn't look up from what he was doing, just kept tightening a bolt or whatever it was he was working on. "Yeah, I know." I waited for him to say more, but he didn't. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I could feel it settling around us like a fog, making it hard to breathe. I don't want you to think you have to keep quiet," I said, the words tumbling out faster than I intended. "Whatever it is, I'm here. You don't have to do this alone." Frank finally looked up at me, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw something there, something like fear or maybe regret, but it was gone before I could be sure. "It's not that simple, kid," he said, his voice low. "Some things are better left unsaid." "Like what?" He shook his head and went back to his work. "Just some things." I wanted to push him, to make him tell me what was going on, but I knew better. Frank wasn't the kind of man you could pressure into talking. He'd tell you when he was ready, and not a moment before, so I let it drop, even though every instinct in me was screaming that something was wrong, that this wasn't just Frank being Frank. This was different. This was something else entirely. As the months went by, that feeling only grew stronger. Frank's silence became more pronounced, more unsettling. It was like he was fading away, bit by bit, right in front of us, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reach him. Not really. But it wasn't until that day at the diner, with my mom and Frank sitting across from me, that I finally began to understand just how deep the silence went, and how much it had already taken. It was one of those unassuming small-town diners with worn vinyl booths, a scattering of old photos on the walls, and the smell of coffee that's been on the burner a little too long. My mom loved the place, said it reminded her of when she was young, before life got so complicated. Frank had never been much for eating out, but he came along without complaint. I guess at that point it was just easier for him to go along with what Mom wanted. We were halfway through our meals when it happened. Frank, who had barely touched his plate, turned to me with a strange look on his face. His brow furrowed, and his lips moved as though he was trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, he blurted out, "Can you pass me the thing?" I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. He pointed at the salt shaker but said, "The refrigerator." Then he reached for the ketchup and called it the window. It was like he was grabbing random words out of thin air, none of them making sense, none of them even close to what he meant. My mom chuckled, her laugh light and teasing. "Oh, Frank, you're all mixed up today. What a funny man." She reached over and patted his hand, still smiling. But Frank didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. His face flushed, his eyes dropping to his plate as he mumbled something under his breath. I don't think Mom noticed the shame that washed over him in that moment, but I did. It hit me like a punch to the gut. He looked like a man who had just realized he was losing a part of himself, something he couldn't get back. My mom, God bless her, kept chatting away as if nothing was wrong. She didn't know, of course. None of us knew at the time that Frank's mind was starting to slip away from. To her, it was just another one of his silly mistakes, something to brush off with a smile and a laugh. She didn't see the hurt in his eyes, the way he shrank into himself a little more with each passing day. After that day at the diner, Frank's silence became more than just an absence of words. It was a wall he put up, a barrier between himself and the world. He didn't trust his own mind anymore, didn't trust that the words he wanted to say would be the words that came out of his mouth. So he stopped talking, stopped trying. He must have felt like it was the only way to avoid those moments of humiliation, the only way to keep some semblance of dignity as his mind began to betray him. Mom, on the other hand, kept right on going, blissfully unaware of what was happening. She was never one to dwell on the negative, always looking for the silver lining. I think she truly believed that Frank was just going through a phase, that he'd snap out of it eventually. Teasing, her little jabs, they weren't meant to hurt. She thought she was lightening the mood, trying to make him smile. She had no idea how deeply those moments cut him, and I never told her. I couldn't. Even when it became clear that something was seriously wrong, even after the doctors finally said the word dementia, I kept it to myself. What would have been the point of telling her? It wasn't her fault. She didn't know. She couldn't have known. I think deep down she started to realize something was wrong as Frank's condition worsened, but by then it was too late. The words had already done their damage. The teasing that had once been harmless now carried the weight of all the things he couldn't say, all the thoughts he couldn't articulate. How could I explain that to her? How could I tell her that those little jokes, those light-hearted quips had driven him deeper into his silence? The truth is, I couldn't. I wouldn't. To tell her that would be to break her heart in a way that would never heal. And for what? Frank was gone now, and there was no taking back the past. When he finally passed, after those grueling years of watching him fade away, I stood by her as she mourned. I watched her struggle to come to terms with the loss, to make sense of a life that had been turned upside down by illness and grief. The worst part was watching her try to reconcile the man she loved with the man he had become in the end. She cried for all the memories they'd shared and for all the things left unsaid. She'd sit by his bedside in the nursing home, holding his hand while he screamed in fear and confusion, trying to comfort him, even though she knew there was nothing she could do to take away his pain. Those were the days that broke her, The days that left her so drained and hollowed out that it was like she was a shell of herself. I saw how it tore her apart, how it wore her down, and through it all, she never once turned away. She never left his side, even when the man she knew was already gone in every way that mattered. It wasn't long after we buried him that the guilt started eating at. Not guilt for anything I did, but for what I didn't do. What I didn't say. There were so many times I wanted to tell her what I had seen, to explain why Frank had pulled away, why he had stopped talking. But every time I thought about it, I imagined the look on her face, the pain it would cause her, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. So I kept it inside, let it simmer there in the dark corners of my mind where it couldn't hurt anyone else. I decided for her sake to carry that burden alone. There are some truths that serve no purpose, some things better left unspoken. Frank had known that in his own way, and now I understood it too. After the funeral, I threw myself into helping Mom. I went up to the cabin with her, the one she and Frank had bought years ago as their little getaway. I spent days fixing things up, doing all the chores Frank would have done if he were still here. I cooked for her, made sure she was eating. Tried to fill the silence in any way I could. My brother and his wife helped too, and together, we did what we could to support her, to make sure she knew she wasn't alone. But even as we tried to move forward, I knew there was a part of her that would never truly heal. How could it? She had lost the man she loved not once, but twice. First to the disease that took his mind, and then to the death that took his body. And there was nothing I could do to change that, nothing I could say to make it better. So I kept my silence, just as Frank had. I buried the truth along with him, hoping that by doing so, I could spare her just a little more pain. Maybe it wasn't the right thing to do. Maybe she deserved to know. But I made my choice, and I'll live with it. Just as she'll live with the memories of the man she loved, and the quiet evenings that became quieter still.